At this point, do you think you're going to change anybody's mind on COVID-19 vaccines? Probably not. But it doesn't mean you can't try. And at the very least, you can get better at identifying how disinformation spreads and trying to respond to people in a rational and reasoned manner, whether or not they're going to accept your arguments. So I may want to make this little video, practical tips for combating COVID-19 disinformation. And specifically, I want to relay an exchange I had yesterday on social media, specifically on Twitter, where I spend too much time. So I posted this tweet. So the tweet has this, I guess you'd call it a meme, quote unquote. And it says, first jab, second jab, booster, Omicron, Deltacron, Megatron, Voltron, Techcron, Decepticon, Pokemon. I mean, honestly, that is, kind of funny. But it's also, I mean, depending on who's posting it or what their intentions were, it of course it can be breeding this deep skepticism about COVID-19 vaccines, as when people ask, well, why are you using these vaccines? If they really work, why do you need to keep getting boosters and so on? And so I just commented, when I see silliness like this, I wonder, are these people not aware that there has been an annual flu shot for decades? In other words, the flu is always changing. You always need to have boosters. You always need to change with the flu if the vaccines are going to continue to be successful. And it's no different with COVID-19, a coronavirus. Now, in terms of effective communication, leading with calling this silliness, I admit, is going to alienate particular people, right? The people who don't think it's silly are going to be irritated and put off by the fact that I called it silly. So I do want to flag that. Honestly, I was not trying to communicate in this tweet to win people over to the side. So be aware that if you call other people's positions silly at the outset, you're going to lose your audience right there. And so I'll own that. Fair enough. But I did get a response. I mean, I got several responses. This is one of them from a fellow named Dustin. He says annual versus 4 to 5 times a year. Also curious if the flu vaccine uses new and unproven mRNA, or if the flu vaccine keeps moving the goalposts. How many folks have the flu vaccine put in the hospital with clots? I think that is meant to be strokes, heart complications, apples and oranges. So what we have here is a tumbling of half-baked talking points. So rather than just get in, I mean, I don't have the time to get into the weeds of all of the disinformation posted in these talking points. So I simply responded with this: are you an immunologist? Let's start there. Are you in a good place? Now, here's what I'm asking. I'm not asking I'm not suggesting you have to be an immunologist in order to have an opinion on COVID-19 vaccines, because I'm not an immunologist and I clearly have an opinion on COVID-19 vaccines. What I'm saying is that there is a basic threshold for disagreeing with and dismissing expert opinion on a scientific topic. And that basic threshold that would be required is that you have some sort of scientific knowledge of your own by which you can make an informed judgment. He responded by saying, oh, did you confuse these with opinions? In other words, I think what he's saying here is I'm simply listing a bunch of facts. And because they're facts, it doesn't matter whether I'm an expert or not. I'm just relaying facts. So I responded by wanting to ground this conversation and the exchange, and more generally, the whole question of how you form reasoned beliefs about issues like COVID-19 vaccines, which are well beyond the expertise of the average person like you or me, who is not an immunologist. The way that we form informed perspectives is by deferring to and trusting in the consensus of expertise, the consensus of expert opinions. And so I said, I defer to expert opinion, like the consensus views of Health Canada, the Center for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, locally Alberta's chief medical officer, etc. We can go on down the list, listing experts, both individuals who represent organizations and then the collective organizations themselves, the collective professional groups. And those are the people that you defer to. And if they have an expertise, if the experts have a consensus opinion, then you defer to that unless you have some reasoned scientific background in order to justify not deferring to it. Another fellow interjected at this point and said, oh, Randall facepalm, if this person was an immunologist, I'm going to bet you wouldn't change your opinion. You've chosen your tribe on this topic. Clearly, no need for thinking. On the contrary, I am thinking. What I'm doing here is epistemology. social epistemology. I'm pointing out how people form reasoned, informed opinions on scientific expertise, points that require scientific expertise that they themselves lack. And the way that you form your opinion on issues that require expertise scientifically that you lack is by defaulting to a consensus expertise. So if experts have a consensus on an issue, now how do you define consensus? Generally, I mean, there's some vagueness in the concept to be sure, but something north of 90% of experts, and the representative bodies of experts. Um, those are the places where you defer, and that's how you form informed opinion. It's not tribalism. It's reason judgment in an area of expertise. In this case, my area of expertise is I can reason in terms of social epistemology. How do you make reason judgments when you lack the expertise? You defer to the experts. And so I responded to this guy. I said, well, that is correct. A single expert in a field, the term expert here, let's define it as possessing a terminal degree in the field of study. So for example, a medical doctor, if you have a terminal degree in medicine, then you could qualify as an expert. Although, of course, you may not be an expert in the specific area, such as immunology, which is something we have to keep in mind as well. But I did agree that I said a single expert in a field does not automatically overwhelm the opinion of a consensus of experts. However, a single expert is at least worth considering. Disinformation sourced from Facebook and YouTube videos is not. So, for example, if this other fellow, Dustin, were to say, I am an immunologist, I've published in these leading journals, and I take a dissenting view on COVID-19 vaccines, then Dustin is at least worth listening to. He's worth considering what he has to say. Although I will still have a heightened skepticism based upon the fact that it is more reasonable, all things considered, to defer to the consensus of experts rather than to defer to the judgment of one outlier over against a field of expertise. So here's an illustration. Now let's move from COVID-19 to cancer. Let's say that you receive a diagnosis of cancer. And so then you look to the American Association for Cancer Research, the American Association, that one's repeated. The Association for International Cancer Research, the Association for International Cancer Research, various other bodies that specialize in the treatment of in oncology. You look to the World Health Organization, you look to the Center for Disease Control, and you look to all the other expertise publications in the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine and the Journal of the American Medical Association and so on. And everywhere you look, the response is that the best treatment for your diagnosis is chemotherapy. Okay, that's the consensus expertise opinion. And on the other hand, you find that there's a guy on YouTube who calls himself Dr. Jones and purportedly has a medical degree from a medical school, and he's promoting goji berry powder for the same diagnosis. Okay, chemotherapy, goji berry powder. Is it simply you have your expert and I have mine? Or is it there's a consensus of experts' opinion on this issue, whether it be chemotherapy, COVID-19 vaccines, versus on the other hand, you got this one outlier who says, don't trust the COVID-19 vaccines, take ivermectin and high doses of vitamin C or something. Make your judgment. Obviously, the fact that the other person, Dr. Jones on YouTube, happens to have a medical degree does not overwhelm or is not equivalent to the consensus of experts. With that in mind, we'll return to Dustin's response to me. He said, for every expert you find, I'll find one of the opposite opinion. So when it comes to that, you use cut and dry statistics and personal testimonials. When perfectly healthy young adults get vaccine injury for a virus less severe than the cold. Anyway, so what he's saying here is, look, we both have experts, right? So in order to break the deadlock of the experts, listen to personal testimonials online, right? People who said that they took a vaccine and then had a bad effect. Of course, one of the problems with that kind of anecdotal evidence is correlation does not entail causation, right? The fact that, let's say, a person uh, got a cold after a COVID-19 vaccine does not entail that the COVID-19 vaccine caused the cold, right? A correlation does not entail causation. I mean, that's one of the issues here. There are all sorts of other issues as well. But anyway, the deeper issue here is that he's trying to have it as a level playing field. You have your individual expert over here. I have my individual expert over here. But of course, we've seen that's not the case at all. What you have is Dr. Jones on YouTube promoting goji berry powder. And what I have on this side is the consensus of expertise opinion on oncology and how to treat this cancer diagnosis, which is through chemotherapy, not goji berry powder. So, as I put it, we're not talking about my individual expert versus yours. We're talking about professional organizations, a consensus of expertise opinion. There is a consensus among professional organizations on the effectiveness and safety on COVID vaccines. Please provide a list of all the professional scientific organizations or medical organizations that share your skeptical perspective on COVID vaccines. Now, not surprisingly, Dustin had no list. Instead, he just went back to another list of talking points. He said, start with a ruling in New York, how they will now offer back pay to the ones who lost their job for refusing the jab. Start looking at infection rate among the vaccinated. Start by opening your eyes to facts that are presenting themselves. Yet your focus is on political driven org. Okay, what is most important here is that final bit, political driven org. In other words, what Dustin is saying here is, I don't have to listen to the consensus of expertise opinion because medical experts, scientists are all politically driven. All the consensus that exists is born of political motivations. But apparently, my individual expert who disagrees with all of these organizations, all of the experts in immunology and healthcare and medicine, my guy is not driven by politics, but all of those organizations are driven by politics. Now, of course, there's no provision here of evidence that the World Health Organization or Health Canada or the Centers for Disease Control or any other group that works with immunology and dealing with viruses and pandemics. There's no evidence that Dustin has provided that they're all politically driven. It's just an assertion which has no factual basis whatsoever. But just think again about the absurdity here. If your friend, let's say, was the person with a cancer diagnosis, and he's opted to take the goji powder because he saw Dr. Jones on YouTube promoting it, and he rejects chemotherapy, even though it is endorsed by all of these other organizations. And then he says, when you say, well, you've just got Dr. Jones promoting his goji berry powder, and on the other hand, all of these professional organizations say you need to take chemotherapy. And if his response was that they're all politically driven, well, you can see the absurdity of that assertion, I hope, right? Who says, first of all, what is the evidence that all of these organizations are driven by politics, that they're somehow promoting chemotherapy as some mass conspiracy? And on the other hand, what gives you such confidence that Dr. Jones doesn't have motivations, such as economic motivations, to get a couple cents for every person who clicks on the goji berry link to his YouTube video, for example? I mean, this is what we're dealing with. This is the absurdity of the logic that is being presented here. So to summarize it, just to pull it all together, again, I think the one thing I would say is don't get sidetracked by all the talking points people are going to have. You'll never get finished running down responses to talking points. In my view, the best way to address this kind of disinformation is to try to give people a framework of social epistemology to understand how people reasonably make judgments about areas that far exceed their knowledge base or their ability to exercise expertise. Right? They just don't have expertise in that area. And virology and immunology, I mean, these are areas that are far, orders of magnitude beyond my very limited knowledge. So, how do I form reasonable beliefs about whether to take a vaccine or not, whether to take chemotherapy or not? I defer to the expertise of consensus. If there are professional bodies, if there are organizations, if there are academic journals and university departments and governments, and they're all coming down on one side, this is what you do. You take chemotherapy. And if the other side are a smattering of individuals who maybe they have a medical doctorate, maybe not. Maybe the medical doctorate is in pediatrics rather than immunology or something else. And for the most part, maybe they have very likely economic motives or something else. Where is it reasonable to defer to judgment, to defer to the judgment of the outlier individual or the consensus of experts? All things being equal, it is to defer to the consensus of experts. Now, this is where you're going to get, of course, into the whole space of conspiracy theories. And what a person can always try to argue is, well, there is some reason to doubt or to reject the consensus of experts. And if you really want to get into the weeds, then you could say, what is your actual reason to doubt the consensus of experts? Simply saying that they are politically driven is not an argument, it's not evidence. And simply assuming that the data that you are appealing to is not politically driven or economically driven or otherwise questionable or dubious, I mean, of course, it's a position you have to defend. So, will you change anybody's mind at the end of the day? Probably not. Certainly not. I suspect not at this point. Although maybe you will just erode a little bit their confidence in their position and get them to think. The one thing you can try to do, I do think, is to challenge them to say that they're engaging in special pleading. Because in all likelihood, the kind of skepticism that they are applying to scientific and medical bodies and consensus of experts with respect to COVID-19 is not going to be replicated in other areas. They probably will take chemotherapy in other areas as well. For example, in meteorology, if meteorologists are all saying that the hurricane is coming, it's going to hit the coast in 2 days, you're paying attention to that. You're not listening to the one guy on YouTube who says there's no hurricane at all, right? So that you have to challenge people to say you are deferring to the consensus of experts in most occasions. So why not in this occasion? And finally, just every once in a while, you will find that person who just loves conspiracies. And so they will regularly just go to the outliers and live their lives accordingly. And you definitely, I suspect, will not change their opinion. Uh, but always, as always, you can try.